Hello and welcome to the second part of our lesson in persuasion. In the first video, we've talked about processing persuasive communication. In this video, we're going to talk about factors that lead to successful persuasion, and we're going to have a closer look at cults. We're going to understand the dangers of joining them and how to resist persuasion from cults. So let's first look at the factors that lead to successful persuasion. Now, the first factor that can impact the success of persuasion attempt is the person communicating or the source of persuasion. There are different ways that a source will be presented to us. They can be obvious, we see them. It could be Jose Marichan, or rather Jose Marichan advertising Shopee 11/11 sale on an internet commercial. Or it could be an average Filipino selling a new dress in a Facebook Live selling. However, sometimes during a persuasive attempt, the source isn't clear or obvious. They might be a narrator you can't see or print ad without any visible source of the persuasion. Now, what makes someone a persuasive communicator? There are certain qualities that will make someone more or less persuasive to the audience. Now, research has found that credibility and attractiveness are important in successful persuasion. Let's start with credibility. Now, a review done by Porn Pitakpak in 2004 on studies from 1950s to 2004 found that using highly credible sources resulted in more persuasion. Now, what makes someone credible? Now, perceived expertise and perceived trustworthiness are the key to credibility. Now, when we say, or rather, perceived expertise is defined as someone we perceive to be both knowledgeable on a topic and has the ability to share accurate information with us. In situations where we have low personal relevance or ability to process the message, it serves as a peripheral cue. Expertise will trigger us to automatically go along with the persuasive attempt because we believe that this person knows what they are talking about. Can you think of some examples? Now, we often use heuristic processing while watching television or even viewing social media. Now, let's say you watched a toothpaste commercial. There is a dentist like this in a white lab coat discussing how effective a brand of toothpaste is. If you are persuaded in this instance, it's because of the cue of the dentist. You automatically think that it's a good toothpaste because this expert told you so. Now, persuasive trustworthiness, on the other hand, is the other aspect of credibility we need to look at more closely. Research, not surprisingly, has found that when we do not feel that the person has anything to gain and that they are sincere, this is a strong indicator of persuasion. If people view someone as trustworthy, they will automatically be persuaded by the attempt. However, if the source is viewed as untrustworthy, even people who have low need for cognition, don't want to think deeply all the time, will engage in a similar amount of message analysis as individuals who are high in need of cognition. Have you ever had the experience of shopping at a store where the employees are working on commission and only make money if they convince you to buy something? Now, when I was younger, I often shopped at a clothing store that used this model with their salesperson. Their salespeople, that is. Now, when you went in, you were automatically approached and often they continued to interact with you while you shopped. This for me was quite annoying because a lot of times I'm not actually shopping but actually just looking around. They would hope that you would buy something and they would get paid more. Now, their perceived trustworthiness actually dropped because it was in their best interest to persuade me to purchase something. So, when they told me that I look great in that particular outfit, I was actually likely to be skeptical of their authenticity. I often avoided that store for that reason. Is there anything they could do to appear more trustworthy? Well, it would benefit them to argue against their own self-interest. If they were to tell you that something you tried on wasn't the right piece for you, that would actually make you more likely to be persuaded by them and buy the other clothes they recommended. Now, another characteristic that can help the persuasive attempt of a communicator is attractiveness. Okay, attractiveness can include both physical attractiveness and likability. As what we have mentioned in the first part of this lesson, we hold a heuristic or a mental shortcut where we believe what is beautiful is good. Research has found that people associate talent, kindness, and honesty, and even intelligence with beauty. These same studies have been done in a variety of contexts, and individuals who are highly attractive are more likely to be voted for, hired for a job, and granted leniency in a judicial system. When we aren't motivated and able to think deeply, we follow the peripheral route, and this is when peripheral cues like appearance can have the greatest impact on persuasion. Another powerful aspect of attractiveness is likability. One of the things that can increase liking is similarity. We like people who are like us. This includes people who share our opinions, personality traits, background, lifestyle, and even when people mirror our behavioral postures and even facial expressions. So, a classic example of the power of similarity comes from a study done in the 1970s with clothing styles. So, during this period, young people wore primarily two types of dresses, what is referred to as hippie or street fashion. Well, the study had Confederates wear one of these types of clothing and then approach people who were wearing one of the two types of clothing and ask for a dime to make a phone call. Now, the result support the fact that similarity has the power to persuade. When Confederates clothing that is matched the person they asked, they were more likely to get a dime from them. So after you have the appropriate communicator, the next step is to determine what type of message content will be the most effective. Now, there are several questions we need to answer in order to completely understand the role of message content in persuasion. Now, what is actually contained in the successful message, or is it full of logical arguments and evidence, or is it presented to elicit certain feelings? Now, two emotions often used to persuade are pleasant feelings and actually fear. Another question we need to answer is, will the way the message is presented make it more or less persuasive? We will also have to decide how to present our perspectives. Do we present our side, or do we present both sides of the story? These answers will be impacted by the audience's processing route. Let's begin with an example. We're trying to persuade people to care about mental health and to change the way they think about it. What kind of arguments should we use? Should we present an argument filled with solid, logical evidence, including reasons for why we need to rethink about mental health? Or would our audience be more likely to be persuaded by an emotional appeal where we scare them or make them feel about the impact of mental health issues on people? Now, we know that audience who are motivated and able will follow the central route to persuasion. Remember, we are motivated to pay attention to the message when it is personally relevant to us. We also need to be able to process it. We need the time to think about it, and the message needs to be presented in a way that can be understood and really think about what is being said. If these conditions aren't met, then we follow the peripheral route. We are going to respond based on on peripheral cues like credibility, attractiveness, and so on. So I am sure you predicted at this point that when someone is following the central route, they are going to be more persuaded by solid argument. Those individuals who are following the peripheral route will be more persuaded by emotional appeal and would-be senators dancing budots instead of would-be senators presenting their arguments. Now, we also need to consider if our audience is likely to have a larger number of individuals with a high need for cognition. This could impact the success of our persuasion attempt. We need to have more solid arguments if we have more of these individuals present. Another important thing to consider is how the people originally formed their attitudes. You might remember in our lesson in attitude, we discussed the difference or the different bases or components of an attitude: affect, behavior, and cognition. We discussed that some people do not have all three bases for each attitude, and that some attitude bases are stronger than others. This impacted our ability to predict their behaviors with respect to that attitude. Now, these findings address that. If your original attitude formation is more affective or emotion-based, then you will respond to persuasive attempts that are made with emotional appeal. However, if the origin of an attitude resulted in a stronger cognitive base, then not surprisingly, you will be more likely to be persuaded by a solid argument. As you might have imagined, it can be challenging to figure out what kind of audience you are dealing with. If they are mixed or you do not have the ability to determine which base is stronger or strongest, it might make the most sense to have an argument that contains both reason and emotion. So, there are different types of emotional appeals that we can make when trying to persuade people. Let's start with evoking good feelings in our audience. When we make our audience feel good, we increase their positive thoughts, and through association, we make a connection for them of good feelings and the message. When we are in a good mood, we are more likely to rely on our peripheral route to persuasion. We don't spend much time thinking about the message. We see that when people are unhappy, they spend more time ruminating or going over and over things. They aren't persuaded by weak arguments. When we watch cable television or scroll through social media, we are afforded an opportunity to analyze these emotional appeals. Can you think of some recent commercials, both on television or in social media, you saw that attempted to make you feel good so they could sell the product to you? Ads selling sodas are often good example for this. For example, Coca-Cola had a campaign using the slogan, "Open Happiness." You will feel so good if you consume this product, or at least they want you to believe that. Another common emotional appeal is to elicit fear. Fear can be very effective most of the time. There are, however, a few situations when it will not work. Fear doesn't work when you are trying to convince people to stop doing something that makes them feel good, like having sex or laying in the sun. It will also won't work when you use too much of it and don't give the audience a solution to avoid their fears. In that case, it's easier for the audience to deny and continue the behavior. Humor and fear combined have also been found to be more persuasive. A great example of something that fear alone isn't effective at persuading, but in combination with humor is very persuasive, is sex and condom use. The fear appeal would want you to think of having your life stolen from you with unwanted pregnancies and potentially losing your life from HIV or AIDS, or the discomfort of sexually transmitted disease, or in this case, conceiving the next Donald Trump. Now, the addition of humor can be seen in this ad by a Brazilian condom company. These kinds of ads are generally funny, and they combat the fear of negative things that come from something we see as pleasurable or sex. So, the message can be presented in different ways, and these strategies can impact how persuasive the message ends up being. There are several strategies that work most effectively when you are processing these things heuristically or peripherally, which we know happens quite often. We can start by looking at the foot in the door phenomenon, which we have already covered in our lesson on attitudes and behaviors. However, if you can't remember what it means, it's the tendency for people to comply with some large request after first agreeing to a small request. It's like when ordering a small fries at McDonald's and the cashier asks you if you want to upsize your order. You already bought something from them. Why not comply to spend a few more pesos to enjoy a large serving of fries? Now, another technique, which is actually a variation of the foot in the door technique, is called lowballing. Lowballing is actually a fascinating strategy. The communicator or the persuader will put forward an attractive offer, one that is hard to say no. Once the offer is agreed to, you will come up with new reasons for why you are glad you made the commitment to this offer. This is where it gets very interesting. The original offer is removed. The whole reason you went along with was because of that desirable offer, and now it's gone. What should we expect? Are we upset? Do we change our minds about what we have agreed to because it isn't good or rather as good as the original offer? Well, no, we don't. We go along with it and are happy about it. Cialdini in 2008 discussed this in his book Influence, Science and Practice. The examples he gave are great. The first one is a traditional sales situation. How many of you, well, you are still students, but probably some of your parents or some of your older siblings have bought a big money item like a new house from a subdivision or a car from a dealership. Now, did they agree to a price with the salesperson and then they leave you to make sure that their manager agrees to it? Now, this is where lowballing begins. You agreed to an attractive offer from the salesperson. They will sell you the car for the price you want. While they are gone, you are coming up with all these new reasons why you made that decision. The car has great mileage, horsepower, an awesome sunroof, tinted windows, a backup camera, and a great sound system. Now, when the salesperson comes back and removes the original offer, which is why you agreed in the first place, you still will take the car and you are happy about it. This technique is regularly used in car sales. Now, another great example occurred with one of Cialdini's friends, Sarah. She had been dating Tim for a while and she wanted to get married. Tim wasn't very much interested in marriage at that point. Sarah ended the relationship, met someone else, and was engaged to be married. Now, Tim comes back into the picture and offers Sarah a great deal. He will marry her if she comes back to him. She leaves her current engagement and returns to Tim. She comes up with all these new reasons why Tim is the right guy for her. Then Tim lowballed her, removes his original offer of marriage, and Sarah happily stayed with him. She has all these new reasons for being with him. So when he takes away one, even though it was the initial reason for that, for her taking him back, it doesn't matter because it's just one reason. She's committed to him, happy and sadly not married. Now, the last technique we will discuss is called door in the face. I know that two of these strategies have the word door in them, and this seems a bit tricky when you are taking a test over the material, but a good way to remember the difference is to actually think about what the phrase says. With a foot in the door, you can picture a small part of your body, probably your foot, getting in, and then once the small part is in the door, the rest of you is not far behind. Small to large. With door in the face, something large is presented and the metaphor door is slammed in your face because the request is just too big. Then you knock and offer a smaller request, which is usually accepted. Now, the smaller request is what you really are trying to get, and not the first request. Now, the two processes that are working to make this technique effective are reciprocity and perceptual contrast. Reciprocity is another peripheral cue. When someone does something for us, we feel in debt to them and want to immediately return to equity in our relationship. This makes sense. Survival would have depended on successful relationship and sharing resources. If you were known as a taker or moocher, that is then would have negatively impacted your relationships. We still see this in our relationships today, even though survival might not be at the core of them. So, with door in the face, when you initially offer, or when your initial offer is denied, and you come back with a smaller offer, the other person feels like you gave in, or gave them something with a compromise you attempted to make. They then are more likely to accept the second smaller offer because they feel in debt to your compromise. Now, the second reason you went along was perceptual contrast. This cue deals with the change in perception related to how things are presented. So, in the door in the face situation, we are presented with something large and then something small. The second presentation of the smaller item after the larger item changes our perception, and we now see it as smaller than if we had just been presented with a small item alone. Now, let's look at a few examples so that it will be a lot clearer to us. First, I want you to clean the house or the entire house. Now, you don't want to? Okay, how about just clean your own room? Well, based on what we just learned, this should drastically increase the likelihood that you will clean your room than if I had originally just asked you to clean your room. First, you want to reciprocate my compromise. And second, your room seems much smaller after being compared to the whole house. This will be a great tool for persuading roommates, spouses, or children to do small things you want them to do. For example, just clean your room. The last common question about message content has to do with whether you can be more successful with just presenting your side of the argument, or if you need to present both sides to be effective. Again, it actually really depends. One-sided appeals work best when the audience agree with you already. A one-sided appeal can be the wrong choice if the audience processes through the central route. It will motivate them to seek out the other side and could result in trust issues, which If you remember from earlier in this video, if you are not seen as as a trustworthy source, that can really damage your effectiveness. Now, the two-sided appeal is most effective and enduring when the audience disagree with you. It can be useful or right from the start to address the opposing side and then present your argument. If you watch television with courtroom scenes, you often see this technique. The prosecutor or defense attorney will start with, my opposition is going to tell you X, but I want you to see it this way. When they don't do this, you're going to spend more time thinking of the opposing argument while they are talking rather than listening to their case. Now, an illustrative example comes from a study done at a university encouraging recycling. They placed signs on the trash can that said, "No aluminum cans, please. Use recycler located on first floor near entrance." Underneath the sign was a smaller one that said, "It may be inconvenient, but it's important." After adding the second sign, which turned the one-sided appeal into a two-sided appeal, 80% recycled compared to 40% before it was added. Now, lastly, let's have a closer look at cults. We should start by acknowledging that persuasion can be good, neutral, or bad, which we will look at more closely with our cult example later. We can persuade people to stop a bad habit or vote for someone who can positively change our country. Think more about mental health, clean their room, or in my case, ask someone to marry me. Now, the focus of this section is on the dangers which we see when people attempt to take advantage of our tendency to automatically respond to peripheral cues or triggers as we save our cognitive resources. Salespeople, con artists, politicians, and crappy relationship partners are a variety of people who can use our natural tendencies against us. This section will focus on the danger of cults. We will look at an example and then the persuasion techniques that were utilized. We will then look at some suggestions for fighting against our automatic tendencies. So, let's look at Jonestown and the cult leader Jim Jones, as shown here. Now, Jim Jones started as simply a pastor of what seemed like an all-inclusive church in Indiana in 1955. In a time of segregation and ostracism of those that were different, Jim created a utopian environment where all were accepted. It was a place where those without family could find family, and those sought a place of equality for all could find it. Now, he moved the church to California in 1965, fearing nuclear war. It was from this point that the church, now called the People's Temple, started traveling down a more sinister path. Most members started by just attending once a week and then committing to more nights a week. They would encourage their friends and family to join. They gave a small amount of money to the church, and that slowly increased until they gave their whole paycheck. When they moved to California, they lived and worked on the church property, which means they sold their houses and cut ties with their families who didn't support the church. Jones also encouraged the children to be adopted by others in the church and for spouses to have sex with other members of the church, especially Jim. He aimed to break their bonds within the church and outside of the church. Now, they eventually moved to the jungle of Guyana as an attempt on Jim's part to protect his people and church. He believed that they were under attack from everyone. Now, after a visit from a congressman who was worried about people who were being held against their will, was shot and killed at Jim's request, Jim forced everyone at gunpoint to drink poison Kool-Aid. A few who escaped into the jungle and a few from the congressman's group who lived helped us to better understand what happened. Now, this cult and the subsequent deaths are so fascinating. There are many documentaries and stories written about what happened. People often think, how could this happen? Why didn't they leave? How could they let someone do these things to them? People think that they would never allow these things to happen to them. Now, let's look at the persuasion techniques that were used and how people automatically respond to them. They had no idea that they were being persuaded to someday voluntarily kill themselves. If you look, foot in the door, which we have discussed earlier and in our lesson in attitudes and behaviors, is running rampant here, as well as lowballing. Jim had them commit to many small requests and over time slowly increased his requests. He did this with church attendance and church work, money donated to the church, giving up custody of their children, and then breaking their marital bonds. Eventually, large requests like moving to another state and then another country were easy to make because they had already committed so much. In order to remain consistent, they had to make these larger commitments as well. They had given everything up for this church's mission. So, Jim used emotional appeal to initially get certain kinds of members, those who were ostracized or didn't have anyone, such as the homeless. He would perform miracles for them or for these individuals. The members who were doctors, lawyers, and more likely to follow the central route were recruited with strong social and political messages. He provided a utopia where everyone was equal and where the elderly were given medicine and taken care of. He recruited with attractiveness and liking. He made himself credible, a trustworthy expert, that is. It wasn't until later that people saw different sides of Jim. It's clear that these individuals committed to something that later didn't look anything like the initial offer. Now, how can we resist the dangers of situations like this? Now, Cialdini in 2008 offers some great tips to avoid the main techniques that are used. We will focus here on how to fight commitment and consistency's powerful pull. He suggests two ways to combat it. First is listen to your stomach and your heart. He says that consistency is often important and good for us in our lives. However, it isn't always like that. As seen in the past part of this video about cults, when you feel trapped by your commitment to a request, you often feel a tightening and discomfort in your stomach. He suggests that in this instance, the best way to combat the feeling is to bring this attempt to the persuader's attention. Tell them that I am not going to go along with your request because it would be foolish to just remain consistent when I didn't want to go along. He says we can't always feel our stomach sign. So ask in our heart of hearts, does it feel right? Ask yourself if you could go back to the beginning with the information you now know, would you make the same choices? If no, then the pressure of consistency should lessen and you can say no. So, persuasion is a complex topic. But hopefully, you made it out with much greater understanding of how you process information and persuasion attempts. either centrally or peripherally. You now know what types of communicators and messages are most effective in different contexts and with different audience. Finally, you are more aware of the dangers of being taken advantage of by individuals who are aware of our frequent automatic responses to peripheral cues. The next video or the next lesson will continue our journey through social influences by examining conformity more closely. So, again, my name is Dex Kamitan, telling you to go get vaccinated, and if you're old enough, go and register as a voter. Thank you for watching and have a great day.